Can you smell it? Can you feel it? It is Set Champs season. And with that, we have another meta breakdown. This has been a really, weird meta game because we had so many weeks in between the release of Shimmering Skies and then the Disney Lorcana challenges. And now we are leading into Set Championships and then the final Disney Lorcana challenge of the season, which will be in Seattle at the end of the month. But before we get there, we get 3 weeks of Set Championships, kind of this localized metagame that you're going to start seeing players, take the information from previous events and really showcase that. And we're gonna get there. We're gonna figure out what is the best deck in the Shimmering Skies metagame. We've had our winners so far: Emerald Steel, Ruby Sapphire, respectively, winning their Disney Lorcana challenges. But is there another, little thing in there? Maybe. Who knows? We're going to find out. But today we're going to look at the full meta breakdown from the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Vegas. That's right. We have all 6 events, every registered deck for an entire breakdown from that. And then we're going to be looking at some of the top decks that you might kind of expect to see within your set championships and kind of just how you can prepare for them and maybe just the decisions that you can make to get better and really just have the best educated choice for your deck for set championships. Let's get into it. So this is the DLC weekend breakdown. That's right. There are over 3,000 registered decks from that past weekend. We only have all of the deck lists that were showcased of over 100 or more registrations. So this is only DLC Vegas, which is North America only. We're not exactly looking at the full breakdown from Birmingham as well. But what you can see here is what people are bringing to tournaments, right? This was going into Vegas. Obviously, yes, Vegas had Emerald Steel win. We had Ruby Sapphire win in Birmingham. But this is what people brought. This is what people registered. These are 3,000 registered deck lists. And you can see some of the most crazy numbers here are the idea that there was 181 Amber Amethyst decks registered. That was more Amber Amethyst than Sapphire Steel or Amethyst Steel, or maybe even some in combination that you expected to see in the most registered decks that's not even here. You can see here that Ruby Sapphire, nearly 800 registrations, Amber Steel, nearly 700 registrations, Amethyst Ruby, just over 600, Amethyst Emerald, nearly 300, Emerald Steel, around 250, Amber Emerald, just over 200, and then of course you can see the rest there with the final of 100 registrations to Amethyst Steel. Now this is a nice breakdown of kind of really what to expect in a metagame. We now have gotten through 2 big weekends. We've seen the success of Ruby Sapphire. We know what the consistency of, from Disney Lorcana challenges and set championships that Ruby Amethyst brings, that Amber Steel brings. We can kind of see Emerald Amethyst making a bit of a breakthrough within the metagame. We've never seen Emerald Amethyst as this high of a play deck in any previous metagame. So you're definitely seeing an evolution there. Emerald Steel has had its ups and downs, but it's also coming off the first win of the season at DLC Vegas. So with that, how do we use that information? What can we take away from this? Well, first and foremost, we can take away that, hey, this is what people believed in going into Vegas. Now the question becomes, will they still believe in this landscape? Will Emerald Steel, overcome? Will that become more of a play deck than Emerald Amethyst? Will it become more of a play deck than Ruby Amethyst? Right? Both of those decks, Ruby Amethyst is kind of it's a pillar of Disney Lorcana in a way where you can always expect to see that in a pretty high number at set championships, because honestly, it's a pretty cheap deck to play. And it really does communicate to not the less competitive player, but I would say the less active competitive player. Players come back for set championships because it's something to win. It's a trophy. It's something different. It's a little bit more than just, $200 in a $1,000 cash tournament or something like that. It is a little bit more. Winning that playmat, winning that set championship card in previous months, or in previous set championships, it was $500-600, maybe even up to $1,000 win. So going into this, yeah, it's a little bit structured differently because we have top 8 instead of top 4. But I still think that these are going to hold a little bit of value, and everybody in the top 8, at least for the first few weeks, might be, a $200, $250, maybe even $300 win. So I expect to see those players that were, very interested in playing Ruby Amethyst in the past guess what, guys? Ruby Amethyst didn't have any new cards really, and the ones that did are an uncommon location, which we're going to look at a deck list that I would expect to maybe see in the set championships coming up. But just an understanding of like how to really dictate that information is okay. Well, if Ruby Amethyst didn't get a whole lot of upgrades, all of those players that kind of show up to these set championships and aren't like there every week for your local, tournament, maybe they play another game, they just come out and play set championships because it's like just this different feel to it. I would expect Ruby Amethyst still be a very highly played deck. And therefore, with my deck choice, I would say, hey, I know that like that's going to show up. I want to make sure that that matchup's right. Amber Steel's another one. Just a really good deck, really explosive, very good on the play, and has a lot of realistic outs on the draw as well. So it's another deck that I definitely see, from this list, that it's one of the most played decks for a good reason. I do think while Amethyst Emerald is a very great deck in the metagame, I'm not certain that it's going to be a breakout deck for set championships. I do think that a particular type of tournament player brings and plays that deck because they believe their skill level with it is higher than the average player. And I'm not sure it's a deck that anyone can just pick up and understand immediately. And therefore, I don't really see too much of it. I don't think it's going to be like a 20% of your meta game at a set championships. The same can be said for Amber Emerald. I think that's another deck that, yes, has had success. Amber Emerald won a Disney Lorcana Challenge in Toronto. It's been successful in the top 16 in Birmingham. There was a couple of them in the top 64 in Vegas. So obviously there's a lot of success there from that in combination. But with the low amount of registrations, between 3,000 players, 200 players there registered their deck, it's a type of player that is very specific and feels very confident with that. So yeah, you might have your local guy that plays Amber Emerald and he's going to play Amber Emerald and you can know that. But when you start really kind of like breaking down and predicting these tournaments, you got to understand that like that's not a deck that's going to show up as like, half the room or even a quarter of the room. I think that you're still going to see Ruby Sapphire as the number one played deck, Amber Steel, and Ruby Amethyst. Those three decks, I believe, will still very likely be the top three decks. So I would definitely utilize that information kind of moving forward and really just understanding like, hey, that's the metagame I should probably still plan for. But now I know that Emerald Steel is a real deck. I understand that like it won a Disney Lorcana Challenge, but like only the true competitive players might like bring it. I mean, like the most active competitive players, like they might pick out that deck and say, "Oh yeah, I have that in my collection." But it's like a $700 deck. So like any players that are not full-time, Disney Lorcana competitive players, they probably don't have all of the cards that are required to play Emerald Steel. And I don't know that they're going to gamble. If I have a $200 Ruby Amethyst deck and I feel good with it, and I don't really need anything else for it, maybe I'll just take my chances in top 8. That kind of mindset might be where I would be at, where I don't know if I expect like saying, hey, I got to spend $600 to build this Emerald Steel deck and then hope that I can make that back over the month. I think that the average player is very likely to just stick with what they have and more like what they're comfortable with and like attacking a deck like Emerald Steel because of the cost of entry, in all honesty. Nonetheless, let's look at some of the decks that were successful and then honestly some of the versions you might be able to best predict are going to come up and show up in your set championships. The first place overall and winning deck list from DLC Birmingham was played by Federico M. I'm not even going to try, guys. I really wanted to. I don't want to pronounce this incorrectly or upset anyone, but a huge shout out to you, sir. I was able to go back and watch the finals. You played wonderful. It was a great matchup for you, a great win on the day. And this list, this list is packing some very interesting choices. And I do think that it's definitely a list that you might see people mold to. I think going into a set championships, understanding that the majority of players are, they're kind of that average competitive player. They show up to their locals every week and they feel comfortable. They might be playing their kooky deck, may not be the most meta deck. There might be a lot of players that come in and just play aggro. So a list like this that has Sisus, that has the ice blocks, that even has like a couple of Medusas. You might even see a little bit more Medusas. In all honesty, I wouldn't be shocked if you have Ruby Sapphires for set championships. go a little bit more and say, I'm going to play a third baby Sisu, or I'm going to play a third Medusa. This way I can have my answers to the uptick of, you know, tragic beasts and things like that. You know, I think you might see some of those things and some of those changes as we mold toward it. But I do think that Be Prepared is going to probably stay low. Too many Emerald decks in the format to get caught with a Be Prepared in your hand. It's just a free discard for their Deceiver of All. You don't really want that. There's also a world that maybe How Far I'll Go, as good as that card is a card that might get cut from this list to kind of make room for other things, just because you'd honestly rather just win the game through one jumps and through Tipos and through, you know, your Grandma Talas and things like that. We don't necessarily need another song in our hand that's uninkable that we can't get rid of, that the Emerald decks are going to just like take away. So I could see cutting those if you're going to make room for some of like the more Ruby removal and things like that. All in all, you know, this deck it's the most played deck in the metagame, period. I do think that at your set championships, this will be 20%, 25%, maybe even 30% of the room in some cases. I know it didn't win, or I don't even think it was in like the top 8. I think maybe it definitely wasn't in the top 4 of the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Vegas for North America, but it did win Birmingham. So you're still looking at a deck that won one of the biggest tournaments of the year, just coming off, you know, a fresh win, and, you know, again, 800 decks registered just in Vegas alone. I have to believe that in Birmingham that number is over 1,000 registered Ruby Sapphire decks. Definitely a deck that people are going to play. They're comfortable with. I think it's very straightforward. It plays good on the play. It's very good on the draw. It kind of just checks all the boxes, and therefore this is the number one deck going into it. I would expect this deck to be the number one played deck in just about every set championships you're in. Now, of course, if you know your store very well and you know that no one's, you know, probably going to play Ruby Sapphire, then hey, you can ignore it. But I think going in blind, not really knowing exactly what the lay of the land is at the set championship you're attending, I would definitely expect that this is the number one played deck. The second place deck was Emerald Amethyst. Now, this is a deck, again, I do not think that this is like your generic anybody can play this deck well list. And because of that, I don't know that I would over expect it to show up at set championships. I do think it'll exist. I think there are players that probably have already been interested in this list. They were excited to see it be successful in Birmingham, picking up the second place finish here by Jonathan. You know, and this list really does pack a very interesting punch. And it really does, in a way, look closer to a Ruby Amethyst list than what I would say the average Emerald Amethyst list has looked like in the past, which was more of like a aggro mid-range deck. This deck really is looking to be a more mid-range control. You know, the Bonsai is deceiving because obviously it's this 2 lore character on a 3/2 body, and it might present, you know, a little bit of a way to say, hey, I'm going to gain some lore and I'm going to be a threat. But the truth is that I don't know that this deck is really ever pressuring to play that card early. It's nice on the play to have it. So, you know, you're like, hey, I'm going to get this 3/2 in play. I'm going to, you know, turn him sideways, gain my lore when necessary. I'm going to take some good trades because he does trade with a lot of characters in the metagame pretty well. So there's a lot that's really nice going on there. But outside of that, and this, you know, one random curse merfolk, the 2 lore gainers are not coming from the early game at all. You know, Cogsworth is a 1 lore, Rafiki's a 1 lore, Clarabelle 1 lore, Snakes 1 lore, Mother Gothels, Ursula Deceivers, Foxes, Crabs, Kit, Cloud Kickers, and even Lyle. All those characters are only 1 lore. So this is not a deck that's trying to win the game fast. It's a deck that's trying to control the board as best as possible, really mess with Reckless and the lore gain situation and taking lore away with Lyle. And of course, interacting very well with the board with Cloud Kickers and your own Snakes and Foxes to kind of continuously have that scenario set up to even prevent the aggro decks from really coming over the top from you. I think it's a very good deck into that type of field, but anyone watching the finals could see that this deck into Ruby Sapphire looked to be a big problem. It's not fast enough to beat Ruby Sapphire, and it was definitely not controlling enough to contend and beat Ruby Sapphire, you know, post turn 6, post turn 7. It just becomes more and more difficult as the game goes on. So if Ruby Sapphire is the most played deck, then I think that you need to figure out a way for this deck to be a little faster and try and close out games before your opponent just has every single Ruby removal, and honestly, your deck just falls short and ends up kind of floundering out of the matchup. Francis picked up a top 16 in Birmingham. Again, Amber, Steel in the top 16. And this is just a list that we've seen over and over again. It is very similar to the DeCandio list that won the CCS 10K a few weeks back that we did cover in a previous meta report. And honestly, I just, there's so many versions of Amber Steel now. It's getting like kind of crazy. Like we have these Lantern versions, we have Piglet versions, we have aggro versions without Lantern with Perdita, we have song versions without Piglet. You know, there's all these different variations of it. And the real truth is that they're all good. They're all powerful. They all can win on the play very easily because that's just how like snowballish this deck gets. And this deck currently, and I think in many of its different like iterations, can play aggro, can play mid-range, can play control. It can just decide in what matchup it needs to do what. And in the hands of the best players, in the hands of players that have been playing Amber Steel for weeks, for months, you know, since chapter 1, if we're being like really truthfully honest, it's a dangerous deck. I do think it's one of the most deadly decks in the metagame. I think against the better player in most matchups, while playing Amber Steel against whatever matchup it is, has a very good chance to win. If I've been playing Amber Steel for 6 months and I play against an opponent who's playing Ruby Sapphire, even if like the matchup is horrendous, if the Ruby Sapphire player doesn't know exactly how to play against Amber Steel, the Amber Steel player has the ability to win the game. It can steal matches that it's not supposed to. And therefore, I do think it's always going to be a deadly deck in the metagame. And any version of it, whether it's this version that we're covering here, whether it's a version in last week's meta report, or even the meta report before that, you know, we do these weekly. There's a lot of different ways that you can look up this list, go to the video, check the chapters of Amber Steel, see what it is. Each and every week, it's been a little bit different. It's been modified. This version, we got Piglets, we got Tinkerbells, we've seen 2 Cinderellas, we have 4 Naveen's, you know, we still have a whole new world. We have all the songs. We have a Greatest Criminal Mind. Like it all looks the same, but there are subtle differences. Not every list is playing Piglet. Not every list is playing Lantern. You know, we've seen lists now that are playing less whole new worlds. We've seen lists that are playing Doc. All of those things can happen. And I just think that you need to understand, you know, if you're not playing this deck, this is one that you want to go and watch some gameplay of, you know, go and watch some of the DLCs, some of those matchups. If there's another channel out there that has specific matchups for this, I'd go watch that too. If you're not familiar with playing against Amber Steel, then you should definitely familiarize with. I do think that if Ruby Sapphire is the number 1 deck played, I honestly do believe this will be the number 2 deck played. Even in a world where Ruby Sapphire is a bad matchup for this, I think it just dominates majority of the other matchups so far, you know, in Disney Lorcana, that it's okay. If my only goal in the set championships is to get top 8, then I'll take my chances on average playing a deck like this and saying, all right, I'll take the loss to my Ruby Sapphire opponent in top 8, or like in Swiss. I don't really care. I'm going to dominate and beat everything else. I'm going to get in top 8, and then we'll just see what happens from there. That's my guess. Hey guys, I want to remind everyone that we have a Patreon for the Forbidden Mountain. We've been trying to get more and more active over there. We just recently put out a primer guide for the Amethyst Steel deck that we played in the DLC Vegas. There's also currently a pinned section for set championships guides. If you're really looking just like a general observation of how set championships play and how you should approach set championships from whatever level that you are, it's definitely in the pinned comments and the featured posts on the Patreon. The link will be in the pinned comment below or description. If you're ever looking to support the Forbidden Mountain, we definitely appreciate that in any which manner. And if you're looking for a place to grow and become a part of a community, we have a private Discord that is really just meant for that. It's meant for talking through games, matchups, deck lists with all the other Patreons, with players honestly like you that are dedicated to getting better at Disney Lorcana. It's a perfect community for that. So definitely look it up, check it out, the pinned comments description below. Okay, so I know that we've seen a lot of Amber, Amethyst, aggro decks, but when this one came across my findings this week in the meta report, I absolutely had to bring it to the table because it is so unique and so interesting. So this was a top 4 deck from Durand Vincent at the Cardtopia tournament, which was a 49-player event. And this is like, if we go back to DLC Atlanta and the deck list that won by Joshua, this has some irkings of that. We have Perdita back, we have the Fairy Godmother back, but now we're double downing on this exert strategy with also the Fifth Spirit, also Spirit of Winter, even Mufasa, of course, making another return here. But this deck seems very, very interesting to me. It's not a deck list that I have played personally at all, but it is a list that you can kind of go through the motions and see what this deck is capable of. And I think it's very interesting that you can have a card like Daisy Duck into a Piglet, into a Pinocchio or something like that, and really be very, very aggressive and kind of have this a way to gain lore and, pick our cards back up with snakes, with Madam Mim foxes and things like that. Of course, having the draw power from Rapunzel is nice, but really the Fairy Godmother is kind of this random key factor that really works well into this list. Having the ability to play a Cinderella and exert any character and then kind of like trade into it with your goat, with your Mufasa, with a crab or fox play is one thing, but now double downing on that and gaining cards like Elsa the Fifth Spirit, and then even going to a greater extent and playing Elsa Spirit of Winter as a follow-up to really lock your opponent out. You might have these games where, Elsa Fifth Spirit comes in, takes something out. The next turn might be a Perdita, pick up my Piglet. And then now if your opponent can't answer Elsa, you might be able to just turn Perdita and Piglet around, gain 5 lore, shift in, exert 2 characters down, gain 3 more lore. That's 8 lore kind of just out of nowhere. And in the process, we're exerting 2 of our opponent's characters down and keeping them from like swinging back and removing your Perdita or removing your Piglet. It's a very interesting shell to close out the game. There is a lot of uninkables here, so it might be some really weird like play patterns that you have to kind of work through. And it's definitely, in my opinion, a very like designed deck to the meta that Durand was expecting. But it's a list like this that really piques interest, and it's definitely things like this that can show up in set champs. And really, kind of the moral of the story is like, just because you didn't see it be successful in a DLC doesn't mean that it can't be successful. If you have been molding a pet deck, if you have been like really sure of yourself in Lorcana leagues and you've been like going 3-0s or 4-0s and you feel good about it and you haven't seen it like show up in a meta report, well, you might see a deck like this just show up out of nowhere, out of left field, and just like really catch people off guard. And that's a big thing about set championships. Again, it's not these players that are, the most competitive, constructive players that show up to these all the time. A lot of the times it's players from other games that are coming in and picking up a deck list they saw that were successful and just kind of like playing games. You might be able to catch players off guard that way. Absolutely, it's possible. If you bring a deck like this and your opponent just doesn't even know what you're doing, you might just pick up a bunch of free wins. And that's not even to take away that this deck is good or not, because clearly, top 4 in a 49-player tournament, the deck has some spice. It has some legs. There might be something truly here. So with that, it's more just a tip from me to you, like, hey, you can kind of play whatever you want in these. If you're confident with it, if it's been successful to, a standard that you believe in, then it's worth bringing that to a week 1 set champs. And hey, maybe it doesn't work out, right? Maybe you got overconfident. Maybe you go into week 1 of set champs and you get pounded. That might happen too. But really the point is like, with high risk, high reward scenario, if you know your matchups, if you know your deck and your opponents don't, hey, gamble a little bit. It's set championships. Have a little fun, enjoy it, and bring the spice, guys. Get on the meta report with spice like this. Seriously, shout out to Durand. This deck is awesome. Now let's take a look at another version of the Emerald Steel deck. So, we saw the list that won DLC Vegas last week, played by Zen. Again, if you want to see that deck list covered in full, check out last week's meta report. That'll be in the description below. And you can kind of see what that version is doing. And then all of a sudden what this version is doing here, played by Scott to a top 32 of the DLC Vegas side event. I believe it was the 9 a.m. on Sunday. And we're sporting, Clarabelle. That is the real key difference in this list as opposed to the other list, is that the other lists that were successful last weekend and top 4 things like that, we didn't necessarily see Clarabelle in those lists, But here we have 2 of the Clumsy Clarabelle, 3 of the 3 cost, and then of course 4 of the Floodborn Clarabelle, because we also still have 4 Morph. So there is plenty of shift targets to get Clarabelle there are plenty of shift targets to get Clarabelle online into play, shifting, singing, doing all the things that you want her to do, and then kind of regaining that card advantage. And what I'll say about the Clarabelle version of Emerald Steel is that the other versions are playing cards like Hypnotize, cards like Sudden Chill. They're kind of like picking apart your hand little by little, utilizing Ursula Deceiver of all. Well, if you're still able to like kind of set the board up for yourself with, a card like a Morph or a Clarabelle Clumsy, or even the 3-cost Clarabelle that's a little bit sturdier than those 2 characters, you can actually still set yourself up to kind of just like instantly come back in the game. Clarabelle in that matchup, in all honesty, the Emerald Steel deck right now, the one that Zan won with, it is not a deck that just like wins quickly. It's methodical. It's very much a prison style deck where it's just like taking all of your resources away slowly and then eventually nickeling and diming you for some wins. Clarabelle, that it kind of flips the script. If you can get that card into play at all, honestly, if you just slam it down on the table, there's a good chance that the Emerald Steel decks have 7 cards in their hand. So all of a sudden, honestly, I've seen versions that have 10 cards in their hand, 12 cards in their hand. So they could spend the entire game nickel and diming you for your resources, taking your characters out slowly by slowly, and then you're just like, Clarabelle. And you're like, oh, how many cards do you have in your hand? 10? Cool. I'll draw 10. Guess what? The game starts over. Like right there, the game is, it's just like a total reset button. So that's why I think Clarabelle is actually very well positioned in any type of metagame where we think Emerald Steel is going to be a higher percentage than what it was. It was in 5th. Let's just say if it goes from 5th to 3rd, in any fashion that happens, Clarabelle starts looking very, very good because it is honestly a direct answer. I personally think Clarabelle was being designed in a world where Bucky did exist, because Clarabelle became a very good answer to Bucky. So if all these Emerald Steel decks are going to be playing Hypnotize, playing the Deceivers, playing Sudden Chills and things like that, then Clarabelle starts to look very good because you're like, yeah, whatever, man, just nickel and dime me, that's cool, and then I'll just drop my Clarabelle, I'll just draw my hand back, like it's fine. So I do think a version like this you might see kind of be like a meta breaker. If you're looking for something to like break serve in the mirror matches, I would honestly look at Clarabelle lines. I do think that it's very good. I think it's very powerful. And I think that like often you have to kind of like set yourself up to play off the top of your deck. And a card like Clarabelle coming off the top might just be like an instant swing moment in any game. So if you're looking for it, yeah, I think this is a nice way to start and say, hey, how do I break that serve? I don't know. Give it a shot. Ruby Amethyst, again, still sitting as the 3rd highest represented deck through basically the first half of the season leading up into set championships. And this version of the deck obviously has a little bit of spice. This was the top 4 deck. This was the top 4 deck from the DLC Birmingham. And we definitely have some interesting, additions here, but it's nothing that is far too shocking and surprising to me. I think the library is one of the best cards in Shimmering Sky. I think it's finding the light of day in a lot of different decks, and it's really showcasing how powerful it can be. So in Ruby Amethyst, why not? I mean, in all honesty, why not? Followed by the castle. I think this like location control aspect here is a very powerful line, especially, and I really do mean this, I felt like, on the weekend, I went 7-2, I think. Yeah. 7-2, or maybe it was 8-2. 8-2 against Ruby Amethyst decks on the weekend for myself. And the 2 games that I lost were games that I didn't start strong. I didn't get off to a good start on lore, on the draw, and my opponent felt comfortable enough to just put a castle into play on turn 4. And honestly, if you're in a position that you can just like play a castle on turn 4 and then turn 5, we just Maui something, or we also Spirit a Winner, not in this particular list, but it has been in other Ruby Amethyst lists. Like, and then, you follow that up with a Tremaine or a Medusa, or you follow it up, you could have maybe your turn 5 is actually Snake, pick something up, and then Sisu, and all of a sudden now we're shifting Sisu and we can clear the board. Anytime that you can like be prepared or Sisu the board and still have a like just a castle in play, the amount of lore gained is just so incremental to the game. And any matchup where your opponent is slow and like just can't get off lore gain and you can feel comfortable just slamming a castle on the table, that's a pretty good thing, guys. Zeus were not even played in the winning deck of the Emerald Steel. So if players are like not making any changes whatsoever to their Emerald Steel decks, then you can go in going, yeah, my opponent probably doesn't even have Zeus. So like turn 4 castle is, I don't know, maybe 6 lore, like maybe 8 lore. Maybe it's like 6 lore, draw a card, 8 lore, draw 2 cards, like things like that. So knowing that that's how much that it can represent and like how much it can slow that deck down even more. Because if they're not gaining lore with like the Robins or the Diablos and things like that, like if they have to actually challenge into your location, it's actually just going to buy you more time. Like if you're preventing them from singing, because a lot of times they also want to use their characters for singing. So like if you're just like, hey, I'm going to play this location that they can't just let the Storm Rage on it or Strength of a Raging Fire it, you're also throwing off their game plan. You're forcing them to interact. And the moment that you force them to interact, cards like Goofy, cards like Spirit of Winter, cards like Maui, all cards that you get to just like drop and play, turn them sideways, and start like really interacting with the board. And I think that that's what this deck is even doing. It's utilizing saying, if you don't answer my castle, if you don't answer my library, I'm probably going to win the game just because of the best floor. And if you do attempt to answer them, I'm going to punish you with characters with Rush. So I think that this strategy in general is definitely a very good one. It's very unique, and it's something that we haven't really seen to the fullest yet. But I do think it's versions of the deck like this that are going to showcase that, hey, we're going to force you to play the game probably not how you want to, and just like really create chaos for any of the steel decks right now that are not respecting locations, not playing Rise of Titans, not playing Zeus, or any of those ways to interact, even like Baboom and things like that. So right now, Ruby Amethyst players, I would probably be like 3 castle, 4 library, or 4 castle, 3 library. I think 7 locations in the deck is where I would be. Just my point to you. Amber Emerald, again, kind of showing up, being the 6th most played deck. And honestly, this deck has not changed much at all. If you really look at this list, it has 0, I do mean that, 0 cards, again, from Shimmering Skies. Were very much just at this point in time, I would say a stock version of this list. I'm not exactly certain if it's card for card, the exact same list that happened to win DLC Toronto, but it looks very close. I think, one of the only differences is 4 Strike a Good Match now are kind of seeing more play. Be Our Guest, been a little more uptick in play. So you might be kind of trading around some songs to work in some different things. But all in all, this is still the same deck. It is just a very much control deck at its heart, at its heart and soul. This prison style deck where you're just removing all your opponents' resources through Sudden Chills, through You Have Forgotten Me's, through Ursula Deceiver. You're bouncing everything back to their opponent's hand with Muses. You're drawing a bunch of cards from Prince John and Diablo. And then you also have the ultimate chump card of Kita to come in, play Akita, easily sing Under the Sea with like any combination of characters that are kind of left around. And just like, honestly, like in most cases, I think that like when you play against this deck, the first time your opponent Under the Seas you, like off of a trigger, if you only have like 2 cards in your hand, if you're lucky to have 2 cards in your hand, they got to be like very special for you to come back from that. I think this deck is one of the best decks ever to just end the game and make it so difficult for your opponent to climb back in. And it's getting closer and closer to being able to just stay ahead. I do think, if we have a slow start, we don't have any real ways to gain lore. If we're not being like risky with gaining lore with Prince Johns and things like that, you might give your opponent some opportunity. I do think that there's a lot of times in this deck that you get the value of Prince John and you're kind of just supposed to start sending him. And I see very often like players just like neglect the idea that he can gain 2 lore. And then all of a sudden it's like turn 15 and you're still on 8 lore. And it's like, well, you could have probably gained 4 to 6 lore with your Prince John, but you decided to just leave it there. Don't do that. Like if the board's clear, your opponent has no cards in hand, If you know the ink combinations of your opponents, do not include characters with rush, or very unlikely for them to include characters with rush. You can be risky. Gain some lore with your Prince John. Like, put some pressure on the game. All in all, I think this deck is great. I think it's powerful. Top 16 in Birmingham. Multiple top 32s for the side events in Vegas and things like that. There were some of these in the day 2. I think there was one in the top 8 as well in the DLC. So, like, it's definitely a deck that's going to be around. It's going to be successful. But I do think it's limited. I don't think that this is a deck that I would expect, honestly, more than 5% of the people to play it. And that might be high for set championships. Hard to say. So with that, of course, Dick Burns, Bear for the Brand. Had to get it in there, guys. We showed it off. I finally got it in the mail. I was excited to wear it. I was very, very happy about it. But seriously, set champs this week. 4 straight weeks of set championships. Mirabelle, playmat, picking up as many as you want, as many as you can. From an educated standpoint, I do think that this card is probably not going to be as valuable as Ursula, even, definitely not as valuable as Stitch was. I think Mirabelle is a very popular character, which is great, but the card is it's just like unplayable. There's currently not a very effective way to play that card at all. If you do not agree with me, hit me up in the comments. I'd love to see your Mirabelle deck, in all honesty. We kind of had a little bit of a joke about it in our Discord, kind of like making like fun little jokes about saying like, oh, we could win the set champions with the Mirabelle deck. I don't think I can win a set champions with the Mirabelle deck, guys. I'm being honest. But if you got the spice, hit me up in the comments. I'd love to see it. I would love to see the deck. All in all, guys, if you do enjoy these videos, of course, we do them every single week. This is it's a weekly thing for us. Meta Report, showing you the data from the previous weeks, previous months, kind of the whole breakdown for this one. 3,000 decks registered at DLC Vegas, which is awesome to report on. Show you guys those numbers. And of course, it's just every little incremental thing. I hope I was able to give you some kind of like tips in this video, just in general, of how to approach your set championships, because we are in that month. And I tried to more target it towards that, of like, instead of saying, hey, this is a Disney Lorcana Challenge weekend, this is what I would expect to be like the winner's bracket of the DLC. I was trying to really be like, hey, this is a realistic thing that likely shows up in this percentage in your set championship. So it was a little bit more targeted towards that. I hope that was a little more helpful in anyone kind of deciding what they want to play while showcasing the successful decks from Birmingham and other events that were held around, honestly, the world at this point. So nonetheless, I'm really great that you guys were able to enjoy the video. Hopefully got some nice information out of it. And of course, if you do like stuff like this, we just had a full breakdown of the list that we played in DLC Vegas, an entire, just guide of step A to step Z of how to play this deck. It's definitely a deck that I intend to play at set championships. It's very good. It's very powerful. One of the best decks on the play, and definitely has ways to climb out of any matchup on the draw. So if you want to look for something spicy, something that you may not have right away, definitely check out the video. You can click on it right there. And if not, if you haven't yet, hit that like button for me. Of course, subscribe if you enjoy the vibes, and we'll catch you in the next one.